faux pas, and Jesus is going to be called upon to step in. If you have a copy of the scriptures, you can turn to John chapter 2. If not, no worries. We'll have it up on the screen for you. You'll notice in the image that we've put before you that we've shifted from part 1 of our John series to part 2 of our John series. We'll be here all the way up until Palm Sunday, and this is what is typically called in the Gospel of John the book of signs. That is, the multiple number of signs that John records that demonstrate the truth of who Jesus is. This that we'll talk about this morning is the first of those signs. John chapter 2, verse 1. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. And then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best until now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples. There they stayed for a few days. The word of God for the people of God. In order for us to understand this story, I want to divide it into 3 big ideas, or 3 basic parts. The first thing I want to wrestle through together is this strange interaction between Jesus and his mother. It's not the main point of the story, but it's a significant enough point that we ought to try to understand exactly what's happening here. And then from there, we'll jump into the bigger idea. What is the meaning of this miracle? What did Jesus actually do? And then lastly, we'll talk about why does John record this miracle? We'll mention when we get there that John's the only gospel writer who records this miracle. So it's important for us to ask, why? Why does he include it, and how does that help us understand what it actually means? Okay. How do we make sense of Jesus' strange interaction with his mother? This, for me, is so classic. This is how I read this story as it goes on, because I read it through my own lens of my own life, right? Jesus' mother asks him a question. But when she asks him a question, she's not really asking him a question. And when she tells him a statement, she's not really telling him a statement, she's actually giving him something to do, isn't she? Have you ever felt this? Has your spouse ever done this to you? Have your kids ever done this to you? Have your parents ever done this to you? "Hey, I think the dog needs to go out." That doesn't mean that you think the dog needs to go out. That means, would you take the dog out, right? A clearer way to say that would be, "Hey, honey, would you take the dog out," right? Or, "What are you getting over there?" The clear question you're asking is, "Can I have some of that, please?" Right? Jesus' mother is like, "Hey, there's no more wine here." Well, she clearly intends for Jesus to do something about it. Now, what is fascinating to me is Jesus' response to this. Do not try this at home, right? This is one of the things that only Jesus can get away with. "Woman, why do you involve me in this?" Right? Can you imagine, right? Your wife or your girlfriend or your boyfriend, your husband, your mom, your dad, whatever, asks you, "Hey, I think the dog needs to go out." Do not follow that up with, "Woman or man, why do you involve me in this? It will not go well for you." This is just a wooden translation of a back and forth here. And then Jesus, as if to really put the exclamation point on, goes, "My time has not yet come." Right? So maybe do try this at home and report back to us next week how it goes. Right? When someone says to you, hey, I think the trash can is full, you know code that means take the trash out, right? So you respond, why do you involve me in this? And if they persist, you say, my time has not yet come. That'll be a fascinating anecdote to tell that story some other time, right? But what you have here, what the author is trying to portray for us, is a tension, a back and forth. Not so much a heated argument or anything like that, but two people who have different ideas on what ought to happen in this moment. You certainly see for Mary, she has a real concern, does she not? It's for these people who are at the wedding. They have run out of wine. Now, for us, we might not understand that, but this is a major social faux pas. Wine and weddings in the first century world of Jesus, they go together. And to run out means you are a bad host. And in a world that's known by its hospitality, as it was in that day, to be a bad host meant to lose your name and your reputation. Everything was on the line. Not least to say that Cana, though we don't know much about it, seems to be a tiny little town, maybe a few miles north of Nazareth. Chances are that everyone in the town was at the wedding. Everyone knew each other. They're all there. Everything's on the line. And what's more, Jesus and his mother are invited, so these are close ties here. And Mary is feeling the weight of this situation, like a good, empathetic feeler, right? Have any of those in the room? It's not me, sorry. I don't know, like the wine's out, too bad. Where's the Diet Coke, right? And so she's feeling it and feeling the concern, and she knows who Jesus is, and she wants him to move into this situation. But Jesus is feeling something very different. Though we know him to be quite empathetic, he also understands that he is on a mission from the Father, and that everything is allotted in a certain way. And that to act in a miraculous way in this moment is going to open the floodgates to who he actually is. And that's why he says, my time has not yet come. It's not time for me to reveal to the masses who I actually am. And yet, fascinatingly, Mary persists. She stops asking him, and she simply says to the servants, do whatever he tells you, right? Get to work, Jesus. Fascinating. So what do we take from this? Well, I think there's a couple things to see here that are really important for us. The first is that Mary becomes a really important model for us in what it means to appeal to Jesus for the needs that we have in this world, and to appeal to him boldly. She is not timidly asking. She hasn't sat in a corner and crossed her fingers behind her back and said, well, he knows what I'm thinking. She's going right to him boldly and strongly with the need and the request, believing centrally that he loves and cares and is empathetic to the needs of his people, and therefore might be moved to action. This is important. Friends, this is a model for how we ought to pray. Not timidly, not reservedly, not saying, well, he knows. Of course he knows. So go to him even more boldly because he already knows the desires of your heart and the needs that you have. And here's the thing, and we don't have time to tease this all the way out. Several months ago, maybe even a year ago, we did a teaching series on the concept of prayer, and reminded, hopefully, of this strange idea in prayer, in that we're called to fully engage in prayer, and yet God is fully sovereign, right? It is that God knows and God does what God knows and what God does. And yet we're called to beseech and to plead and to ask God to intervene on our behalf. And we try to figure out, so what gives? How can both of those be true? The great theologian J.I. Packer said it's an antinomy, right? Two things that are distinctly true, seemingly irresolvable, but because they're true, they have to coexist. Or perhaps better said by Dallas Willard, I really like this, is that prayer is actually a divine negotiation. That is that we are called into divine negotiation with God. Isn't that exactly what Mary's doing here? Here's the thing about our divine negotiation, Dallas Willard says. We happen to just not know what's actually negotiable. So we can negotiate everything, not knowing what actually is negotiable. And so the core of prayer, or bringing our appeals to God through Jesus, are at first and foremost submitted to His will and His authority. God is going to do what God is going to do, and He's going to accomplish His ultimate purposes. But I don't know any other way to read the story except to say that if Mary hadn't intervened, there might not have been wine at the end of the story, right? These two things kind of sit side by side, and so we're called into this intercessory, into this bold asking of God to meet the needs of our moment, believing that some things are negotiable. That God was able to move in this situation without making a public spectacle of things in a way to meet the needs of the people. This is the beauty of prayer. And I would suggest to you that had Jesus pulled his mother aside because he's empathetic and didn't want to make a spectacle and said, "Mom, I can't do this, and this is why," she would have stood down. Because the second thing is true, that Mary for us is a perfect and beautiful model of faith. Think about her belief in this moment, right? She says to other people, do what he tells you and it will work out. She's not just believing it in her mind, is she? She's bringing other people into her circle of faith with such a strong belief in it. And I would say to you that belief can only be that strong if it also is counterbalanced by the truth that believing that Jesus saying no to one of our requests is ultimately for the greater good of his kingdom and his causes. Mary believed that. That's who she is. That's what she did. She becomes a model for us. I'd be remiss if I didn't pause and say that Mary is not a means by which we can come to God. Right? Some might read this, particularly of other Christian persuasions, and say, see, Mary has Jesus' ear and she can change things. That's not the case. The rest of the New Testament is careful to tell us that you can come to Jesus just as boldly as Mary did in this moment. And you ought to, with the same kind of faith, the same kind of appeals, but submitting yourself ultimately to the sovereign will of God for his glory. Strange and crazy interaction, but so helpful for us in understanding the kind of interactions we're called to have with God. So, on to the meat of the story. Jesus turns water into wine. I mean, we've heard about this before. Some of you have read the story. Some of you have just heard about it before. What exactly is going on here? Jesus tells the servants to fill these 6 stone jars that were used for ritual cleansing. You remember perhaps in the Jewish faith that cleansing with water was a significant part of regular activity because certain things in the world and in life made you ritually unclean. And so you needed to cleanse yourself. And these basins provided the means by which to have cleansing. Jesus says, fill them up with water all the way to the brim. Isn't it interesting? I can imagine the picture of these things being filled all the way to the brim. They can see the water going into it, and they can see when it's filled all the way to the top, I imagine that it's still water, right? But when they dip the ladle in there and pour it out, it's wine. What has happened here is a massive transformation, is it not? It's an act of new creation. It's Jesus, who we learned in John chapter 1, who is the creator of all things and therefore can intervene in creation and set things right, acting in a creator-like way to change the substance of one thing into a very other thing. This is something only God can do. This is not an act of magic or dark arts, but an act of new creation. And then this wine is taken to the master of the banquet, and he tastes it, and you remember the story, he's blown away by the taste of it. Because in the normal social order of things, You put the good stuff out first, because as people have more and more wine, they're less and less able to taste how good the wine is, to make things easy to understand. So you bring the best stuff out first, so the people think that this is this great stuff and always to the end. So we would imagine that in this case, that's no different. That the groom and those hosting the party, in fact, did bring the best stuff out first. So what was being tasted was incredible at the beginning. But now, what Jesus has offered even surpasses what was offered in the beginning. That this new creation work of Jesus actually is much more profound than anything humans or existing creation can produce of its own. That Jesus not only meets the needs of the moment, but does so exceedingly, is the picture of this miracle. And fascinatingly, he does it not publicly, but privately. John is very careful to tell us the only people in on this is Mary, Jesus, the servants, we don't know how many of them there are, and it seems like at least a couple of the disciples, because we're told that they believe on the basis of this after the fact. But for everyone else, there's just great wine coming out because these people are throwing a great party. That is, that the transformation that Jesus has worked behind the scenes becomes a blessing to the masses. You see this picture? It's really significant and really, really important. In this miracle, Jesus is showing us, because we have a behind-the-scenes look, that He is divine, that He is God, that He is creator, and therefore that He is new creator, that He can change the substance of something to another, and that what He does is very, very good. Much better than what we can produce. And that the transformation that seemingly happens behind the scenes is for the blessings of everyone at the party. So, final question. Why does John tell this story? And you say, because it's a cool story. It really is. But if it's so cool, why did the other gospel writers not tell it? Isn't that fascinating? It's a pretty interesting story. It would fit in Matthew somewhere, wouldn't it? Or Luke, or Mark, perhaps. But John's the only one who tells it. And so we have to ask ourselves, why is that? Well, first and foremost, it's possible that the other gospel writers don't include it because it is such a private miracle. You say, private? He turns water into wine. But only a handful of people knew that he actually did it, right? So whereas you're feeding 5,000 or 4,000, or whereas you're calming storms or doing other things that are much more visible for the world to see, this behind-the-scenes testimony, perhaps, we don't know, perhaps to the other gospel writers is less of a foundational witness to the truth of who Jesus is. Perhaps. But it's more important for us to ask not why did the other gospel writers not include it, but why did John include it? And not only why did he include it, but why did he include it right at the beginning of his whole gospel? And the answer is because it sets the whole gospel up perfectly. This story is a microcosm of everything that Jesus intended to do and will do as we journey through the Gospel of John. Think about it with me for just a second. In this story of the water being turned into wine, we see a transition from an old covenant to a new covenant. It is never lost on you when you explore the details of a narrative story. These story writers are trying to write as concisely as they can to tell a compelling story about who Jesus is. So when details are included, they are important. Do not skip them over. And this story is loaded with details. First and foremost, where does Jesus tell the water to be put? In old ceremonial ritual washing vessels. They are symbols of the old covenant. Do you know what I mean when I say that word? The law that God, the covenant relationship that God made with his people, Israel, in the Old Testament, after they had been brought out of Egypt and were about to dwell with him in the land. In order for God to dwell with his people, they had to live and abide by these covenant realities so that they could coexist together. One of them was this ritual cleansing, because God is pure and holy, and where he is, nothing broken or dark or sinful or dirty can be. And so one of the ways that existed for that relationship to be maintained was ritual cleansing. And now Jesus takes these jars and does something fascinating. What does he fill them up with? Wine. Well, you'd say, well, of course, that's exactly what Mary asked him to do. And you're right. And you'd say, and that's what needed to happen for the wedding. And you're right. But for John, this story is significant to tell at the beginning of his gospel, because ultimately what Jesus is going to do when we get to the end of the gospel is trade in Old Testament ceremonial vessels for a New Testament, New Covenant communion meal, which is based around the cup of wine. Do you see it? That Jesus is out with the old and in with the new. And this is not just times are a-changing. This is that old system that demanded you continually follow regulations in order to keep God close to you is now going to be totally undone, in that blood shed for you on the cross of Calvary is going to once and for all make you clean, so that God and you can dwell together now and forever. John, when he's thinking about how to start the gospel, says, oh, remember what happened at Cana? I see it now. The whole thing is unfolding before us. This old covenant symbol is being replaced with new covenant realities. Don't you thank God for what he has done in Jesus? What's more, Jesus, or John, I should say, in telling the story, is letting us know that this new exodus out of sin is underway. Do you remember all the way back before the old covenant was established, before the Israelites had gotten to Sinai to hear this new covenant law, they found themselves in captivity in Egypt. Remember the story? 400 years making bricks, oppressed by the Egyptians, in captivity. God raises up Moses to go to Pharaoh and to say, hey, let my people go. We're done with this. They're going to come worship me now. And Pharaoh says stubbornly, not a chance. And so what does God then begin doing? Do you remember? Plagues. Do you remember the plagues? Do you remember what the first plague was? Water was turned into blood. Do you remember it? The Nile River becomes filled with blood. In the same way, these jars are filled with wine, which ultimately symbolizes Jesus' blood. John is a master storyteller. Don't miss it. Something amazing is afoot in the work of Jesus. And that's why, friends, the background, the setting of a wedding is perfect. Because if you remember the Old Covenant story, and it's not been that long since we did Exodus, right? A little under a year ago, you remember rescued from slavery into a covenant relationship with God. And what happened in the middle? That moment at the mountain of Sinai where God committed himself to the people and the people committed themselves to God in covenant relationship that spoke of a Hebrew wedding. In the same way, we will find as we go on to read John, that John sees in Jesus a new wedding ceremony burgeoning. John will continually, Jesus himself doing so, announce Jesus as the bridegroom and his disciples, or the church, as the bride. It's a beautiful picture that becomes a microcosm of all that God intends to do through Jesus. And we see it here. What's more, then, this story of turning water into wine forms what a literary scholar might call an inclusio. You know what that means? Like, let's talk in more common people terms. Bookends. You know what bookends are, right? One at the beginning, one at the end, right? Bookends to John's gospel starts with this reality of turning water into wine at Cana, finishes with this reality of Jesus' death and resurrection. The microcosm and then the fullness of the story. And so again, the details of the story should not be lost upon us. How many ceremonial jars were there? 6. Why is that important? Why weren't there 5 or 4 or 3 or 8 or 9 or 10? Well, in many ways, 6 becomes the number of the day of the death of Christ, doesn't it? The 6th day is the Friday. It's the day of Calvary. And so much so that if you trace the days, and John's very careful to do this in the chapter 1, we have ourselves moving through days in chapter 1 to get to the 6th day in this moment at the wedding story of Cana. John using phrases like, and then the next day, and then the next day, and then the next day. And understanding that John has set his whole gospel on the theme of new creation. Remember how he starts? In the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God. Jesus is the new creator. All of this language of days then makes sense. But how does the wedding feast start? Those first 3 words of John chapter 2. Was it 4 words, 5 words? I don't know. And on the 5 words. And on the 3rd day. When you hear that language, what do you think of right away? On the 3rd day, the stone was rolled away from the tomb of Jesus. The stone ceremonial jars are pushed away for the new resurrection life that is born in the new covenant blood of Jesus for us once and for all. How can Jesus do any of this massive transformation? How is this new creation program going to work? How on earth can Jesus make all things new and bring cleansing to all things? John is ultimately going to tell us through his death on the cross, where sin and death are seated squarely on his shoulders and defeated. And ultimately, in his resurrection from the dead. In his death on the cross, atonement was provided. In his resurrection from the dead, atonement becomes efficacious, right? Or effective. It works. Because he himself is the firstborn from among the dead. Jesus is not just meeting the moment of a social faux pas. He's not helping light a unity candle or getting a string quartet across an open bridge. He's not removing tire tracks from the train of a wedding gown. He's not even simply filling a wedding goer's bellies with good wine. He's doing it privately, but oh so symbolically for his disciples who will see the whole story unfurl. And here's what I want you to know. That ultimately, Jesus' aim is your transformation. His ultimate aim is not turning water into wine. It's turning what is broken in you into new life. And he's the only one who can do it. And this story, understanding all that it points forward to, demonstrates to you and to me that he's exactly the one who's capable of doing it. That on the cross of Christ, all that is broken inside of you, all that has defined your past, all that has sullied your name, all that has brought you down, has been defeated. To use the Apostle Paul's language, the old is gone, the new is here. And in his resurrection, newness of life is not just gripped tightly by Jesus for himself, but offered to anyone who themselves would grip him tightly. This is the invitation of John. Come and be made new. His invitation to you isn't, hey, I can turn water into wine. Pretty cool wedding trick. His invitation to you is, I can turn what's broken in you into something so good it will astonish the masses. It is a very private transformation, is it not? Internally happening in you, a belief that conjures up in yourself that grips Jesus, a transformation that is internal and happens over time. We don't know exactly when the water became wine. In the same way, we don't know the exact moments or seconds that the transformation that Jesus has worked, is working, and will work in us is fully happening, but we know it is. And here's the deal. What is private then becomes a public blessing. As the rest of the world drinks of the incredible wine that Jesus has worked in your life. And ultimately then, when they're told what has truly happened, it becomes all the more embraceable. Think about this story with me for just a second. A couple of things could have happened in this wedding story, right? Could have been that the wine ran out and that was that. No more wine. It's a plausible ending. Could have been that the wine ran out and they got water. We're drinking water for the rest of the night. And water wasn't always the greatest thing to drink in that day because it was full of things that made you sick. Could have been that water became regular wine. But the story is that water becomes incredible, almost the picture of perfect wine that becomes a blessing to the world. When other people are interacting with you, what are they drinking? Nothing? Old ceremonial water? Regular old human-made wine? Or something seemingly supernaturally transformative? Something that tastes so good, it probably isn't from around here. Right? That's what Jesus wants to do in your life. You pray with me? Jesus, we thank you that you are eminently interruptible. That we can come to you at any moment, at any level of urgency, pleading to you the needs of our current existence. And we thank you that not only can we, but you encourage us to do just that. Thanks for Mary and the example she gives to us. God, may we be bold in bringing our needs to you through Jesus. And may we submit ourselves to your ultimate answers and your ultimate will. But we believe, God, that your ultimate will is our transformation. That through Jesus, you are making all things new, including us. And so, God, may it be so. May we cling ever more tightly to Jesus for the transformation that we need. We praise you, Lord Jesus, King Jesus, for making it possible through your work on the cross and your victory in the resurrection. On the basis of that, might we, like Mary, have such profound faith in our personal transformation that we heed her words to the servants and do whatever you tell us, believing that it's for our good. Amen.